The 20th century was the bloodiest age in all of world history. During this era, for the first time, humanity was introduced to the concept of a world war. Taken together, World Wars I and II resulted in a total of 65 million people losing their lives. About half of these casualties were civilians who had nothing to do with these wars. Children, defenseless women, and the elderly alike were massacred cruelly. So one might ask, how did the world find itself in the midst of such colossal insanity? How did people so easily sacrifice both their own nations and those of others? What sort of thought lay behind this cruelty? In this film, you can discover the answers. Wars have existed almost since the dawn of humanity itself. Competing political and economic interests led people to take arms against one another. Weapons and armies have developed hand in hand, and so wars have grown ever more violent and destructive. However, until the 20th century, wars took the form of front battles, in which soldiers of two armies would meet on both sides of a battlefield, and the fighting would revolve around this axis. In these conflicts, it was the soldiers alone who were killed. But in the 20th century, a new breed of war was born, one targeting not only soldiers, but also the masses of people. The effects of such wars would be felt in not just a handful of countries, but rather were like they had taken the entire world in their terrible maw. Throughout history, war has inflicted great suffering and losses to society. A number of prophets who were sent to the people as messengers warned them against this calamity and turmoil. And to Madian we sent their brother Shuaib. He said, "My people, worship God, and look to the last day, and do not act unjustly on earth, corrupting it." Through the voice of their prophets, the Israelites made a promise to God not to shed blood. "And when we made a covenant with you not to shed your blood and not to expel one another from your homes, you agreed and were all witnesses." In 19th century Europe, colonialism was widespread. European powers such as Great Britain and France had established colonial empires in all four corners of the world. Germany, which had established its political unity later than other countries, was striving to become a forerunner in this race. By the beginning of the 20th century, interest-based relations had split Europe into two opposing poles. Britain, France, and Russia were on one side, and Germany and the Austria-Hungarian Empire ruled by the Habsburgs of German origin were on the other. The tension between these two groups escalated with each passing day, and finally an assassination in 1914 provided the spark for war. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the throne of the Austria-Hungarian Empire, was killed by Serbian nationalists who sought to curb the empire's influence in the Balkans. Within a very short period of time, provocations following on the heels of this incident pulled the entire European continent into war. First, Austria-Hungary declared war against Serbia. Russia, a traditional ally of the Serbians, then declared war against Austria-Hungary. Then, one after another, Germany, Britain, and France entered the war. The fuse had been lit. Before the war had even begun, the German General Staff had drawn up a plan and decided to take control of France through a sudden attack. To achieve this aim, the Germans entered Belgium and later crossed the border into France. Responding quickly, the French army stopped the Germans on the banks of the River Marne and started a counter-offensive. Although both armies suffered serious losses, no progress on the battlefront was to be found. Both the German and French soldiers hid in trenches in order to protect themselves. As the result of a series of attacks stretching over several months, some 400,000 French soldiers were killed. The death toll of German soldiers reached 350,000. Trench warfare became the main strategy of World War I. Over the next few years, soldiers practically lived in these trenches. Life there was difficult in the extreme. Soldiers lived under the constant threat of being bombarded, and they constantly faced extreme stress and fear. The bodies of those who died had to remain in these places, and soldiers had to sleep next to the corpses. When it rained, the trenches overflowed with mud. More than 20 million soldiers who fought in World War I suffered horrific conditions in these trenches, and most of them died there. Within a few weeks of its being established by a 1914 German attack, the war's Western Front was essentially fixed in a stalemate. The soldiers burrowed in these trenches were trapped at a distance of only a few hundred meters away from each other. Every attack launched in an effort to end this stalemate was going to cost more lives.